The Second World War ended with parades and peace treaties, but not everywhere. In the ashes of empire, new borders were drawn not by geography, but by ideology. Among the jagged lines of history, one scar stood out, the 38th parallel. It sliced across the Korean peninsula like a wound, a political compromise between victors who had never walked its hills nor spoken its language. To the north, Soviet tanks, communist banners, and Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla shaped by war. To the south, American advisors, fragile democracy, and Syngman Rhee, an exile-turned-president with more ambition than power. Both claimed the same dream, one Korea, united under their rule. Both were armed, trained, and waiting. For 5 years, the world pretended the division was temporary. Koreans rebuilt homes from rubble, planted rice in burned fields, and prayed that the Cold War would pass them by. But at dawn on June 25, 1950, thunder rolled across the parallel, not from the sky, but from the barrels of Soviet-made Tu-34 tanks. The North had come south. The illusion of peace shattered in an instant. The peninsula would soon become a furnace, a place where empires tested will, and brothers killed brothers beneath the same flag. The world called it a police action. History would call it something else entirely. The Forgotten War. The first shots came at dawn. North Korean artillery roared across the hills, pounding border outposts along the 38th parallel. Columns of tanks, grey, massive, relentless, rolled forward through the morning fog, crushing fences and machine gun nests as they went. South Korean defenses collapsed almost immediately. Poorly equipped, lacking armor or air support, their soldiers fought bravely but were outnumbered 10-1. The invaders advanced 30 miles on the first day. Refugees flooded the roads, endless streams of civilians carrying whatever they could hold. Mothers with infants, farmers leading oxen, school children walking barefoot through smoke. They moved south as the horizon burned behind them. In Seoul, panic spread faster than the news. The government fled. Bridges jammed with civilians and soldiers retreating side by side. American military advisors rushed to evacuate embassies, burning documents in courtyards as gunfire echoed from the hills. The United Nations condemned the invasion. President Truman, only 5 years after Hiroshima, vowed that aggression would not go unanswered. The U.S. 7th Fleet sailed for Korea. Planes lifted off from Japan, bearing the insignia of a world that had just sworn never again to fight, yet found itself at war once more. By the third day, North Korean troops had reached the outskirts of Seoul. Civilians waved white flags, others hid in basements. Propaganda loudspeakers blared promises of liberation, even as the city trembled under artillery fire. In the mountains north of the capital, a young South Korean lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We have no maps, no food, no orders. Only the knowledge that if we stop, there will be no South Korea left to fight for." The invasion was swift. It was brutal. And it had only just begun. June 28, 1950. 3 days after the first shot, Seoul fell. The Han River Bridge, the city's last lifeline, exploded beneath retreating South Korean troops, killing hundreds of their own civilians who were still crossing. Smoke swallowed the skyline. North Korean tanks rolled into the heart of the city, their treads grinding against cobblestones once laid by merchants, poets, and children who had believed peace would last. Posters of Kim Il-sung replaced street signs. Loudspeakers declared the liberation of Seoul. In truth, it was conquest. Thousands were rounded up, government officials, police officers, teachers suspected of loyalty to the South. Many vanished overnight. Families buried photos and letters to hide their pasts. Meanwhile, remnants of the South Korean army fell back toward the southern port of Busan, burning supply depots behind them. Every mile they retreated, the world's map of freedom shrank. In Washington and Tokyo, generals stared at maps covered in red arrows. Could the United Nations hold Korea, or would all of Asia fall? For the people on the ground, strategy meant little. A child searched the rubble for his father. A nurse treated the wounded with no medicine left. A priest rang the church bell until a shell struck the tower. In 3 short days, the city that had survived colonization, occupation, and war was once again a ruin. But amid the ashes, word spread, reinforcements were coming. The United Nations had voted. The United States, Britain, Australia, and dozens of others would send men. Help was on the way. Until then, Seoul belonged to the North, a symbol of how fragile nations could be when divided by ideology and indifference. By August, South Korea was nearly gone. The North's army swept down the peninsula like a tidal wave, pushing what remained of UN and South Korean forces into a small pocket around the southern port of Busan, less than 10% of the country's land. Behind them lay ruin. Ahead lay the sea. There was nowhere left to run. But here, surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted, the defenders made their stand. American Marines dug into muddy hillsides. South Korean infantry held broken ridges with bare hands. Rain turned trenches into rivers, heat turned corpses into silence. Every day, artillery fell. Every night, attacks came through the darkness. At times the lines bent, but they never broke. Supplies arrived through the port, tanks, ammunition, medical aid, a lifeline from Japan that kept the defense alive. Air support bombed roads, bridges, and columns of North Korean armor trying to break through. General Walton Walker issued the order, stand or die. And they did. The Busan perimeter became more than a battlefield, it was the last thread of a nation's existence. Letters from soldiers at the front tell the story better than history books ever could. We fight knee-deep in mud. The dead lie beside us. But the line holds. And the line held because of something beyond orders, stubbornness, belief, and the refusal to surrender a country's soul. By early September, the North Korean army had spent its strength. Its supply line stretched thin, its morale fading. For the first time in months, the world saw a glimmer of hope. Far to the west, in Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur studied a map. He traced his finger along the coastline near Seoul and said quietly, "We'll land here." The place was called Incheon. The plan was impossible. And it would change everything. September 15, 1950. Before dawn, the sea off Korea's western coast was black and violent. Tides rose 15 feet. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and destiny. This was Incheon, a narrow harbor with treacherous currents, shallow mudflats, and seawalls twice a man's height. No military planner thought it could be done. But one man insisted otherwise. General Douglas MacArthur, dressed in khaki and confidence, called it the bold stroke that would turn defeat into victory. His peers called it madness. Yet that morning, the madness sailed. An armada of 260 ships carrying 75,000 men approached the coast under cover of naval bombardment. Shells shrieked overhead, the shoreline vanished in fire. When the tide fell, landing craft grounded on exposed mud. Men leapt into the sludge, clawing their way toward the seawall as bullets ricocheted around them. A Marine sergeant shouted, "Get up there, boys! It's a short climb to heaven." They threw grenades, hooked ropes, and scaled the concrete. Within an hour, the wall was theirs. By nightfall, the city of Incheon was in Allied hands. By the next day, the North Korean army, caught between Incheon in the west and Busan in the south, began to collapse. The UN forces pushed inland toward Seoul. For 3 days, the city burned once again, block by block, house by house. When the smoke cleared, the South Korean flag flew above the capital. Crowds wept and cheered, the nightmare seemed over. MacArthur, standing among the ruins, declared, "This is not the end, but a new beginning." It was a beginning, but not the one the world expected. Victory had awakened ambition. The armies would not stop at the 38th parallel. They would march north. They would chase the dream of uniting Korea by force. And beyond those mountains, unseen in the mist, another army was already watching. Autumn 1950. For the first time, the war seemed won. The United Nations coalition surged northward through golden fields and burned villages. American tanks rolled past cheering crowds waving white scarves. South Korean units raised their flags in cities long lost to the enemy. The farther they advanced, the quieter the land became, too quiet. General MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo proclaimed that the troops would be home by Christmas. He believed China would not intervene, that no power would dare oppose the momentum of the West. But not everyone shared his confidence. A young intelligence officer warned, "We are advancing too far, too fast, into a country we do not understand." Still, the march continued. By late November, UN troops had reached the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. Soldiers dipped their helmets into the icy water, joking that they could see the lights of Manchuria. They did not know that tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers were already in the hills above them, silent, waiting. At night, strange bugles echoed through the mountains. Then came whispers, volunteers from the People's Republic, moving like ghosts. The war that had seemed nearly won was about to explode into chaos again. It began with silence. Then the sound of a horn. On the night of November 25, 1950, waves of Chinese troops, more than 300,000 strong, poured down from the frozen hills. They moved without radios, without vehicles, guided only by flares and moonlight. Their rifles were old, their coats thin, but their numbers were overwhelming. American and South Korean units reeled under the assault. Communication lines broke. Entire battalions vanished in the snow. Survivors spoke of endless horns, whistles, and war cries in the darkness. This was no longer a war of movement, but of survival. The once advancing UN forces now retreated south, pursued relentlessly through valleys of fire and ice. At Kunuai, a convoy of American trucks was ambushed. The road became a killing ground, bodies frozen where they fell, vehicles burning in the dark. An officer radioed simply, "We are no longer fighting for ground. We are fighting to get out." Seoul, liberated only weeks before, was lost again. MacArthur demanded permission to bomb China itself, even to use atomic weapons. Washington refused. The world held its breath, teetering on the edge of another world war. By January 1951, the UN armies had fallen back to the south of Seoul. They dug in once more, tired, bleeding, disillusioned. Winter had arrived, and with it came one of the coldest campaigns in human history. If hell had a season, it would be winter. If hell had a name, it would be Chosin. In November 1950, 30,000 US Marines and their allies found themselves encircled near the Chosin Reservoir, deep in the mountains of North Korea. The temperature plunged to -35°C. Weapons jammed. Fuel froze in tanks. Blood turned solid before it hit the ground. The Chinese army, more than 10 times their number, attacked from all directions. Every ridge, every pass became a death trap. The Marines called it the Frozen Chosin. They fought not for victory, but for escape. Roads were blocked by wrecked vehicles and dead horses. Wounded men were carried on sleds made from rifle crates. When the ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare hands. In the midst of this, Colonel Louis Chesty Puller told his men, "We're surrounded." That simplifies things. For 2 weeks, the Marines broke through ambush after ambush, dragging their wounded and dead through the snow. Navy pilots flew low, dropping supplies and bombs that lit the mountains like stars. At night, the aurora shimmered faintly over the battlefield, beautiful and cruel. When they finally reached the coast at Hungnam, they had covered 70 miles of ice and blood. They left behind 17,000 casualties. The Chinese, 3 times that number. The port was evacuated under fire, 100,000 soldiers and civilians lifted by sea to safety. When the last ship left, engineers detonated the docks. Flames rose into the sky, a farewell to the dream of uniting Korea. A war that began with summer thunder had frozen into tragedy. The world no longer spoke of victory. Only survival. By 1951, the war had frozen in place, not just in weather, but in will. Both armies dug into the hills near the 38th parallel, the same invisible line where it had all begun. Mountains that once echoed with the charge of tanks now throbbed with artillery. Shells howled endlessly, turning peaks into craters. Trenches snaked through mud and snow, manned by men who no longer asked why. They called it the meat grinder. The front shifted by yards, not miles. A hill taken by dawn would be lost by night. Battles were named not for strategy but for suffering: Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill. Rain turned earth to slime, winter froze it solid. Rats, lice, and hunger were constant companions. Soldiers rotated in and out of the line like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their uniforms stiff with frost and smoke. Letters home spoke not of heroism, but exhaustion. Every day is the same. We climb a hill, lose friends, climb it again. No one remembers where we are. No one remembers why. In the skies above, jet fighters tangled in the first aerial duels of the jet age, sabers versus MiGs, speed replacing strategy, death coming faster than thought. Civilians fared no better. Villages vanished under bombardment, orphans wandered roads strewn with ash. Entire families lived in holes dug into frozen hillsides. And yet, amid the misery, both sides held, stubborn, immovable, unyielding. The war had become a test not of might, but of endurance. A contest between ideologies fought by men who only wanted to go home. No victory was left to win. Only survival remained. They began in July 1951, in a small village called Kisong, later moved to Panmunjom. Around a wooden table sat men in polished uniforms, faces carved from fatigue. Outside, the guns still thundered. Inside, the war became words. Maps were unrolled, lines redrawn, every inch of ground argued over like property in hell. The fighting paused, then flared again. Each ceasefire was broken before the ink dried. Months turned into years. Over 900 sessions of negotiation followed. For every word spoken in the tents, a life was spent on the hills. The main issue: prisoners. Thousands of captured soldiers refused repatriation, North Koreans and Chinese who feared return, South Koreans who had nowhere left to go. Their fate stalled the peace. Meanwhile, at the front, soldiers joked that they would die before the diplomats finished their sentences. Many did. War had become a background noise to politics, a hum of artillery under the chatter of typewriters. At last, on July 27, 1953, after 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days, the guns fell silent. An armistice was signed, not peace, only pause. The border was fixed almost exactly where the war had begun, the 38th parallel. No victory parades. No banners. Just relief, and the soft exhale of a world too tired to cheer. The war ended, but memory did not follow. They called it the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the global victories before it and the Cold War tensions after it. Yet for those who fought, it was unforgettable. More than 36,000 Americans, 138,000 South Koreans, and 400,000 Chinese and North Koreans were dead. Millions of civilians perished, entire villages erased without record. In the frozen mountains, dog tags still lay buried under snow. In fields once soaked with blood, farmers plowed up bones that no one came to claim. In Seoul, widows waited years for letters that never came. In Pyongyang, families praised sons who never returned. In distant countries, veterans returned to silence, no parades, no recognition, only the ache of memory. One Marine wrote years later, "We fought in a war that didn't end. It just stopped. And we were told to forget. But they did not forget. Not the smell of snow on burned metal. Not the sound of bugles in the dark. Not the faces of friends who froze smiling. In hospitals, nurses remembered boys who asked if the line had held. In homes, parents remembered sons who had left with songs and returned with silence. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting because the world demanded it, and then moved on without them. The war ended, but memory did not follow. 70 years later, the guns have quieted, but the war has not. Across the Korean peninsula, the demilitarized zone stretches like a scar, 250 kilometers long, for kilometers wide, the most heavily guarded border on Earth. Barbed wire. Watchtowers. Landmines half a century old. On one side, neon lights blaze over Seoul, a nation rebuilt from ashes into a symbol of resilience. On the other, Pyongyang stands in isolation, its people marching beneath portraits of leaders who still speak the language of war. Every dawn, soldiers from both sides stare across the same narrow strip of land where millions died. Sometimes they salute. Sometimes they simply stare. The war never signed peace, only an armistice. Technically, it still goes on. Tourists visit the DMZ now, cameras clicking where bullets once flew. They see wild deer grazing where minefields were laid, cranes nesting on barbed wire. Nature, indifferent, has reclaimed what men could not. But beneath the quiet, the tension remains, a heartbeat of unfinished history. The Korean War was never forgotten by the land itself. Its mountains still whisper, its rivers still remember. In the north, old veterans tell their grandchildren that they fought the Americans and won. In the south, men in museums tell theirs that they fought the communists and survived. Both are right. Both are wrong. Because in the end, the war's only true victor was endurance. The will of a people divided yet unbroken. And so the line remains. Drawn in haste, held in blood, kept in silence. The 38th parallel. Where a nation became two. And a war became forever.